Hello, everybody. A happy new year to everybody out there listening. What you're about to hear is a bonus episode from the Patreon feed. It's about the great Jorge Luis Borges story, The Library of Babel. One of the great short stories ever. I definitely think it's worth a read before or after you listen, so I linked to the story in the show notes. Once or twice a year around here, we like to remind people that you can support the podcast if you want to join on Patreon. You can get bonus episodes and other perks. I think we're up to like 50 bonus episodes now, something like that, including my podcast series on Nazi Germany and the battle for the human heart, my series on the great television show Arcane, and of course, a series on Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, one of the great books of recent times. You can also get an email from me for free every month with my recommendations from the world of history, psychology, fantasy, TV, books, movies, and more to come, of course. You can also make a one-time purchase of those podcast series. They make a great holiday or birthday gift. And again, you can also just join for free, which is a great way to show support and still get periodic updates on what I'm doing. So I'll link to the Patreon page in the show notes. In other news, I've been putting out a bunch of smaller videos on TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, just a different format for me, flirting with the algorithm and seeing how it goes. So you can check out that stuff on social media as well. I'm working on getting a newsletter going. It's a slow process, but you can also sign up for that in the show notes. And you can always just continue to show support for the show by simply continuing to listen and maybe even telling a friend or two. So with all of that out of the way, I hope you have a great new year. Thank you for the support over the years. It's been an amazing run here, and I hope you enjoy the Library of Babel. Those of you who have listened and been fans of the podcast for a while, first of all, I thank you. But secondly, and more importantly, in this matter, you know that I'm a big fan of short stories. Thus far, I've covered a couple of Ted Chiang stories, a couple of Ken Liu's stories, Ursula Le Guin, David Foster Wallace. I'm a fan of the short story myself, but I also think that it makes for hopefully an interesting and educational and ultimately digestible podcast. With short stories, you can have all of the things that are in real stories and in real histories, things like characters and narratives, underlying themes and overarching philosophies. And you can get all of that stuff in a way that is a little bit less time intensive than, say, watching an entire television series or reading an entire novel. So for me, at least, I like the short story format. And one person I haven't covered in the main feed of the podcast that I probably should cover and probably will cover at some point on the main feed is Jorge Luis Borges, the pride of Argentina. Borges was a writer who was influential in a lot of ways, but he's a name that pops up a lot as far as people that I respect who were influenced by him. And he really paved a way for a lot of modern short stories and even movies and television shows that are swirling around in pop culture today. So Borges is the man. I certainly recommend his short story collection. It's called Labyrinths. And in that collection, there's a story that's probably his most famous story, and it's a story that gets read a lot in intro psych or philosophy classes. It's called The Library of Babel. I'll attach a PDF of the story in the show notes, and as always, I encourage you to read it because it is famous for a reason. First of all, it's good, but second of all, it really encapsulates the style of Borges almost perfectly. It's bizarre. There's huge thought experiments that are mind-boggling. You're never really quite confident in what you're reading, never really fully understanding what's going on, and maybe that's for a reason. And somehow through all of that, there is still this human connection and this somewhat human narrative that is able to be woven through a very short, couple of page long story. So in the Library of Babel, it's told from the point of view of a librarian who, I guess, lives in this library. It's made obvious early on that the library is basically synonymous with the universe as a whole. The library is infinite, or at least functionally infinite. And as an infinite library would, this library contains books on everything that you could possibly imagine. In a infinite space, there is basically no limit to the realm of experiences that can be had. Borges describes this by saying, quote, "The library is total, and that its shelves register all the possible combinations of the 20-odd orthographical symbols, a number which, though extremely vast, is not infinite. In other words, all that it is given to express in all languages, everything. The minutely detailed history of the future, the archangel's autobiographies, the faithful catalog of the library, thousands and thousands of false catalogs, the demonstration of the fallacy of those catalogs, the demonstration of the fallacy of the true catalog, the Gnostic Gospel of Basilides, the commentary on that gospel, the commentary on the commentary on that gospel, the true story of your death, the translation of every book in all languages, the interpolations of every book in all books." End quote. Hopefully you get the idea. The library is functionally infinite, although maybe not quite, and it contains everything: the past, the future, the present, every variation of every variation that you could possibly think of. And then all of the variations of all of the variations of the possibilities and impossibilities that you couldn't think of. Borges spends a lot of time talking about the parameters of the library and the geometry of it, and a lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what this library might actually look like. There's some cool drawings if you just do a Google image search. But anyway, I think Borges is not hiding this idea that the library is basically the universe. Most people have an understanding of a universe that is infinite, or at least ever expanding, right? So in that way, there are a lot of parallels between the library and the universe. Now, this description of the library and the question of whether or not this is a parallel to the universe, and the further questions that go along with that about things like free will and meaning and living inside of the library, are all questions that Borges plays with in the story. One of the cool human elements of the story is this idea of the librarians inside the library trying to figure out what is going on. Faced with this vast infinity of possibilities, how do people respond, and is humanity capable of understanding all that's going on in this library? Borges describes a couple different types of people or librarians who may be wandering through this infinite library, but I want to focus on three in particular that he singles out because I think they have some real world significance and meaning behind them. One group Borges calls the vindicators. I'll let Borges describe them, saying, quote, "When it was proclaimed that the library contained all books, the first impression was one of extravagant happiness. All men felt themselves to be the masters of an intact and secret treasure. There was no personal or world problem whose eloquent solution did not exist in some hexagon," meaning some part of the library. "The universe was justified. The universe suddenly usurped the unlimited dimensions of hope. At that time, a great deal was said about the vindications, books of apology and prophecy, which vindicated for all time the acts of every man in the universe and retained prodigious arcana for his future. Thousands of the greedy abandoned their sweet native hexagons and rushed up the stairways, urged on by the vain intention of finding their vindication. These pilgrims disputed in the narrow corridors, proffered dark curses, strangled each other on the divine stairways, flung the deceptive books into the air shafts, met their death cast down in a similar fashion by the inhabitants of remote regions. Others went mad. End quote. So I think we all probably know this person, right? The person who is constantly looking to vindicate and justify the knowledge that he or she already has. For this person, there is no problem too big or question too deep or answer too complex. The solution is always a perfect vindication and perfect justification of everything that they believe and do. Usually this person is less interested in the questions and more interested in the answers, because there must be an answer for everything, and everything is just a combination of inputs, which they know and are aware of. But interestingly, Borges says that one of the problems with these vindicators is that in their quest to vindicate themselves, they end up bumping heads with other vindicators from other parts of the library. So if humanity is nothing but everybody trying to justify and vindicate their own prior conceptions and beliefs on how the universe works, Borges describes a world of war and chaos and death and suffering. The ultimate conclusion of missing the forest for the trees and only valuing answers without taking time to contemplate the questions. Interestingly, at the end of his rant on the vindicators, Borges says that the vindications actually may exist. The justifications may exist in some universe, given that the library is infinite. But of course, the vindicators never realize that in an infinite universe, the probability of finding those answers is 1 divided by infinity. The next group that Borges describes in the library that begins to coalesce is similar to the vindicators. He calls them the inquisitors. The inquisitors become obsessed with trying to figure out the mystery of the library, the meaning of the universe, and the ultimate answers to why everything exists. The inquisitors are not so arrogant as the vindicators, because the inquisitors don't think that they already have the answers, or they're not certain they necessarily have the answers. But they do believe that there is one explanation, and this comes in the form of one book. Given that this library is infinite, there has to be some combination of letters, some combination of characters that is the perfect summary of all of the rest of it. And for the inquisitors, if a book is not that master book, that ultimate key to unlock the universe, then everything else is just chaos and randomness, and ultimately meaninglessness. Because while there may be the one true book that unlocks the rest of the mysteries of the universe, there are an infinite number of misleading books and books that mislead you along the path to be misled, and so on and so forth. For the inquisitors, oftentimes this leads to depression, because again, it can seem like chance and chaos are ruling the world. There seems to be a lack of meaning in this orientation of the universe for the inquisitors. Now, the final group that Borges describes is the purifiers, and the purifiers believe in addition by subtraction. So they see all of this chaos and randomness and chance, and they want to try to eliminate it. And by eliminating the things that they see as not important, ideally, this gets them closer to finding the ultimate vision and the ultimate key to the library. Ultimately, for the purifiers, just like for the vindicators and just like for the inquisitors, this is going to be a hopeless pursuit. As Borges points out, you could eliminate every meaningless book there is in existence, but in this infinite library, there's an infinite number of the same exact book with 2 periods at the end of the first sentence instead of 1, and everything else is the same. So how much addition by subtraction is even possible in this environment? So it seems that for Borges and for his main character here, the librarian who's sort of opining on the situation in the library, he believes that things are pretty gloomy. The vindicators don't seem to have it right. The inquisitors don't seem to have it right. The purifiers certainly don't have it right. And nobody really seems super close to figuring out the library and figuring out what's going on. Towards the end of the story, Borges talks about this idea, saying, quote, "The methodical task of writing distracts me from the present state of men. The certitude that everything has been written negates us or turns us into phantoms. I know of districts in which the young men prostrate themselves before books and kiss their pages in a barbarous manner, but they do not know how to decipher a single letter. Epidemics, heretical conflicts, peregrinations which inevitably degenerate into banditry have decimated the population. I believe I've mentioned the suicides, more and more frequent with the years. Perhaps my old age and fearlessness deceive me, but I suspect that the human species, the unique species, is about to be extinguished. But the library will endure, illuminated, solitary, infinite, perfectly motionless, equipped with precious volumes, useless, incorruptible, secret." End quote. For the librarian, and perhaps for Borges as well, things look pretty bleak for humanity. But perhaps there is reason not to be totally pessimistic, because one of the problems that all of those groups we talked about, the vindicators, the inquisitors, and the purifiers, one of the problems that all 3 of those groups had in common was trying to parse through the noise. In a universe, in a library where there's an infinite number of books and combinations and variations and experiences, everything can seem chaotic and random and meaningless. Trying to parse through and figure out the truth and the key to the library is something that humanity has a tendency to want to do no matter what group they're in. But the librarian, the main character of the story, points out that this would be a mistake to look at things this way because, remember, in an infinite library, even what seems to be meaningless and chaotic and nonsense also must have meaning. Borges says, quote, "The impious maintain that nonsense is normal in the library and that the reasonable and even humble and pure coherence is an almost miraculous exception. They speak, I know, of the feverish library whose chance volumes are constantly in danger of changing into others and affirm, negate, and confuse everything like a delirious divinity. These words, which not only denounce the disorder but exemplify it as well, notoriously prove their author's abominable taste and desperate ignorance. In truth, the library includes all verbal structures, all variations permitted by the 25 orthographical symbols, but not a single example of absolute nonsense." End quote. That's a bit of a confusing section there from Borges, but he goes on to say, basically the idea is that, again, what might seem like meaningless and stupid nonsense to somebody who's never read this book in the library or experienced it before, in an infinite universe, this is filled with meaning and purpose in some other perspective or some other way of looking at the world or some other culture or some other part of the library. So perhaps this idea that there still can be meaning in a infinite and chaotic universe is one reason to maybe be at least a little bit optimistic. At any rate, Borges ends the story in classic Borges fashion with a footnote basically saying that somebody has postulated that this whole idea of a library is stupid because wouldn't it make a lot more sense just to have an infinite book, a book that contained an infinitely number of thin pages, and each page would fold into the other page, and therefore you could have an infinite number in a much smaller space. It's a very Borgesian ending to conclude things with a footnote that seemingly turns things on its head and makes you reponder the story itself. And like many things Borges, I'm not quite sure what it means, but I know that it's going to be worthwhile for me to spend time thinking about it.